Good evening, colleagues. I am Tracy Little. My module, A Question of Inclusion, was created with my Inclusive Schools pilot project in mind, which is not to say that the content will not be beneficial to those educators who are currently in an inclusive school system or thinking about creating an inclusive school, or special education instructors or pre-service and in-service teachers. I took a structured approach to creating my module, looking very closely at the analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation phases. This made the task more manageable, and it became more evident as to where UDL principles could be most aptly applied. Many teachers are entering our system with limited to moderate understanding of inclusion. In planning my module, A Question of Inclusion, consideration was given to how principles of universal design for learning and human-computer interaction could be demonstrated to encourage participants to elevate themselves from having this static notion of inclusion to developing a growth mindset, with a view toward establishing inclusive classrooms through the use of universal design for learning. The highlight for me in planning this module was the realization that all three principles of universal design for learning, engagement, representation, action, and expression are all interconnected. If we want to foster the development of expert learners in our classroom, then it stands to reason that they must be highly engaged. In order for them to become highly engaged in activities or in the learning experiences in the classroom, material, course content must be represented in a way that is accessible to every single learner in our classroom. As I reflect on my experience with Universal Design for Learning, I'm drawn to that proactive approach to planning that was necessary. So I needed to know my audience in order to really get an idea as to what sort of activities I would be able to create for them. Then I also thought about ensuring accessibility, which referred to how well the learners were able to engage with the environment, the materials that were created, the technologies that were used, and then options, of course, for demonstrating their knowledge. High expectations for all participants is always on the top of my list because I always like my students to know that they can reach beyond what they think their capacity is. Their experience of the content must be planned in various ways because as one concept is taught, it could be represented in various media, with various media. We can have posters, we can have books. While the teacher is lecturing, we can use demonstrations for presenting the same concept at the same time so that all of our learners is immersed in that learning experience at the same time. No child will be left behind, no learner will be left behind. Reflecting on my experiences with utilizing UDL in developing my module, I can only say that it was a thought-provoking process. I used it to help demystify inclusion, determine its efficacy in the Inclusive Schools pilot project. It was used to help transform traditional mindsets. It was also utilized for purposes of scaffolding. And this point for me is so critical because one person's starting point may be another's peak. And we wouldn't want our participants to become disengaged from the topic, quite like we want to ensure motivation, high levels of engagement within our classrooms. I also utilize the UTL to help ensure flexibility and variability of content, technology, representation of topic matter. Our classrooms are transitioning. Therefore, as educators, we must quickly adapt to the needs of our students, whether they be visible or invisible. So to our course developers, I'd just like to say that our classrooms have learners across the spectrum, and their needs must therefore be represented in the planning process. We must also ensure authentic and meaningful experiences for our learners by engaging their cultures. And this can be done when planning and implementing content, materials, technology, so they feel embraced, welcomed, accepted, and respected. This appeals to their emotional intelligence and therefore motivates them to want to learn. Classroom context is a huge consideration. In my instance, it is an inclusive classroom setting, and therefore equitable learning experiences must also be evident. In this local context, the students come from marginal areas. As such, technology must be accessible. So perhaps we may consider platforms that can be supported by mobile phones and respective applications. When we are designing assessments, consider that although it may be time intensive in a UDL classroom, we must allow students to demonstrate their learning in various ways. Consideration, therefore, must be given to how students will be allowed to be evaluated for their learning in the classroom. Course developers should also consider applying the principles of variability, usability, and flexibility to courses to allow accessibility for all learners. They must be purposeful in planning, thereby ensuring meaningful experiences for each student because, of course, meaningful experiences help them to feel more connected to the content and they perform at their optimum. Consider cognitive engineering as well when developing courses, as this ensures alignment of clearly stated objectives, course content, supporting technologies, and assessment. In closing, I'd like to say that universal design for learning is an ideal as it relates to best practice. When creating inclusive classrooms, we may still have those educators who do not buy into their framework, but for the few who do, a little goes a long way. Creating inclusive classrooms with universal design for learning is our children's future. Thank you.